Okay, the joys of recording a podcast. This is our third attempt to record this one.
Yeah, there's somewhere around there.
So it's going to sound differently because we had to come up with an entirely different system because the system we previously used, the main recorder busted. So we tried a different recorder, which decided that it wanted to make either popping noises throughout the entire recording or totally drop the words.
Yeah. We'd have entire syllables dropped, in mid-sentence, and it just wasn't working out.
So we had some very candid discussions and when we recorded before, so hopefully this is an improvement. 3 times the charm for this.
Hopefully.
Okay. Welcome to Unearthly Upstate. My name is Mari.
Welcome back. I'm Matthew.
And this is our final episode of Season 1. This is our premiere season, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
And we're going to end it, but going back up to the foothills around Remsen, New York, to Stueben area. And it's very appropriate. It's called Stueben because in the foothills, there is a memorial to a very influential military man who I really believe without his help we would be part of the British Empire still. And his name is Barron Von Stueben. And I'm going to use Stueben throughout the episode, even though there is people who insist it's Stueben and there are people who insist it's Stueben. I'm using Stueben. That's easiest for me.
Okay, me too. Yeah.
So, in the foothills of the southern Adirondacks, near a little town named Remsen, sits a little-known New York State memorial. As you drive up the long driveway, you see a small cabin to your left, surrounded by a forest. The view from the cabin is beautiful, overlooking the Mohawk Valley. It is a quiet, simple place. A path leads off the parking lot deeper into the woods. There you will find a large marble obelisk, the final resting place of one of the most colorful, interesting people from the American Revolution, a man that helped turn the ragtag volunteers and militias into a fighting force that beat back one of the strongest militaries of that time. His name, Baron Frederick Wilhelm von Stueben. If the grove is haunted, it's not scary. Instead, it's very peaceful. The ornate obelisk looks slightly out of place as you approach it, but it is hidden deep in the woods. In the sacred grove, walk up the path and look back, the memorial has seemed to disappear into the forest. And the 2-room cabin seems too simple, too small for a man that during his lifetime must have seemed much larger than life. Okay, so we're going to go into the history of this man. If you want a quick Cliff Notes version of his life, Drunk Histories did a good job of it.
Yeah, it's not bad.
It's not bad. They got all the good points. Here we go into a bit of the history of him. Most people have heard of George Washington, but how many have heard about the Prussian officer that brought discipline and European military training to the Continental Army? You might have. His name is probably repeated across the country, across statues, schools, and parades, but you might not know why. Most famous example, Ferris Bueller's Day Is Off. The parade that Ferris Bueller sings Dankeschön in is a Stueben parade. It was an actual parade that they hold in Chicago.
Yeah, and they were actually able to shoot the scene.
In the actual parade,
In the actual parade.
So there you go.
Which was pretty neat.
There's a parade immortalized for Stueben. From Chicago. And you will find that in a lot of places in America where there were German settlers. There is going to be something named after him. There's going to be a statue. There's going to be a school. There's going to be streets. And I think I even grew up knowing his name, but not knowing the connection he had to the Revolutionary War for years. And then to move where we did and be that close to his final resting place was kind of neat, I think, because we got this amazing guy in our backyard.
Well, there's a lot of history in and around the what's known as the Oneida Carry. Mm-hmm. And this is the area where Stueben wound up with his
retirement,
basically his military award that he got from the Continental Congress. Well, but we're going to get into that.
He will tell you right now, he did not fight in that area.
No.
But it was kind of appropriate he still ended up there. Mm-hmm. All right. Von Stueben was born in Magdeburg in 1730. Most of his younger years were spent in Russia with his father, who was an engineer lieutenant. They returned to Germany when he was 10. By the time he was 17, he was already a Prussian officer. He was a member of an infantry unit and a staff officer in the 7 Years' War. His service led him to be given an assignment in Frederick the Great's headquarters. By the time he was 33, he had been discharged from the military. By 1775, he was deeply in debt, and that's going to be a common occurrence in his life, you're going to find out. Through his connections from his status and in the army, Stueben was introduced to Benjamin Franklin in Paris. Franklin could not offer any pay for Stueben. He returned to Prussia, where he was faced with accusations of homosexual affairs. He returned to Paris and agreed to go to America as a volunteer. Franklin sent a letter that introduced Stueben as Lieutenant General in the King of Prussia's service. A white lie.
Yeah, a bit of an embellishment.
Yeah, Franklin was good for embellishing things, and here's a good example. Stueben made the trip to America and presented himself to Congress. They agreed to let him volunteer and sent him to meet George Washington. He arrived at Valley Forge on February 23, 1778. There was a slight problem. Von Stueben spoke German and French, and most of the Americans at Valley Forge spoke English. Alexander Hamilton and Nathaniel Greene worked as interpreters for the Baron. And the Baron was not impressed with the volunteers. With regards to military discipline, I may safely say that no such thing existed in the Continental Army. A famous quote by Friedrich Wilhelm von Stueben. Yeah, he was not impressed with the Americans.
Yeah, he arrived at camp to discover that the soldiers were using their bayonets to cook their meat rations. And
among other things.
And, well, one of the things that he did was establish sanitation. Mm-hmm. Members of the Continental Army relieved themselves wherever they wanted. Many didn't bathe, and garbage was strewn about the camp, which in itself was in disarray.
As gross as that is, can you just imagine how much disease was passing through because of that?
Mm-hmm. All the parasites and everything.
Oh, man. So I bet, he comes in and he's like, what the...
Not to mention the vermin that probably...
yeah. So, okay, here's a real basic, hygiene thing, and our colonial militia is not even doing that.
Yeah.
So that was one of the first things he had to do was, kind of like teach him basic hygiene, really.
Yeah, before he could even get into the meat of training them to fight. Mm-hmm.
Yep. Mm-hmm. After establishing what today would seem like a basic military infrastructure, Stueben set out to actually train the men. He started with 100 men. These 100 would in turn train more. Many of the Continental Army men did not even have a basic uniform. Von Stueben would train them wearing a full military dress uniform, swearing at them in German and French. He had to recruit Captain Benjamin Walker to translate the curses and orders into English.
Right.
Picture that scene. You got these farmers and these, these guys are there volunteering. They don't have anything. And here's this dude in full military regalia screaming at him in German.
Oh, yeah. He must have been a sight to see when he first arrived, dressed in, more layers of clothing probably than any of these, any of the people in the ranks have ever owned. Yeah.
Well, that's where Drunk History really proved it, because imagine his entrance, and he was like, he was in a sleigh, and it's just awesome. And he comes in like a rock star.
Right, yeah. And probably leaving everyone in the ranks to think that, oh, wow, who's this dandy?
Yeah.
Who's this guy supposed to be?
Yep. But he was doing his job. So to make sure that all the men were trained before they were put into a unit, Stueben introduced the new system of training. Each company commander was responsible for the training of the new men. So, not only did he have to introduce basic hygiene and sanitary infrastructure to the Army, he also had to introduce a good way of making sure the training was consistent among all the troops.
Yes, and he pared down the 64 drill, which is what we used over at Fort Stanwix when I was a volunteer for the 3rd New York. He pared down those moves down to just a few from the 64 drill. For instance, there are several steps you got to go through in the 64 drill in order to just order arms.
Right.
Stueben pared it down to just grasping your musket by the barrel and then bringing it down to the right.
Oh, wow.
Just one movement. And in the 64, there's, let me count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, about 5 or 6 movements.
Okay.
Just to order arms. Because there's a couple other movements couple other orders you have to go through in order to get to order. And Stueben just cut it right down to just one movement. Okay. And that went into his manual of arms, which, by the way, was used right up to the War of 1812.
Yeah, I think they based a lot of our training still on it. It's just been improved upon since then. So, yeah. And you mentioned the bayonets. Yes, most of the men were using the bayonets to cook food or to use as a knife.
Yep.
Makes sense. Everyone was issued a bayonet, and you might not have your own, And the system of cooking on flat pieces of metal had been around. I mean, whole cakes, they were cooked on hoes, the implement.
Yeah.
Von Steuben's training turned it into another weapon at their disposal. During the Battle of Stony Hill, it was the bayonet training that allowed the Continental Army to win. They battled with unloaded muskets.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
They couldn't even get a shot off because they didn't have the equipment.
That? Well, I don't know if that was because they had no cartridges. They were issued ammunition, but they probably weren't ordered to load their muskets, and they just
went ahead with the bayonets.
Yeah.
Which at that time was still pretty formal on a battlefield, even, that this was early gun warfare. But a bayonet could be far more deadly sometimes when you got into close combat.
And intimidating.
Yeah.
When you get thousands of troops in a line charging at you with...
basically spears at that point. Yeah.
Pretty much. You're starting out with a weapon that's already about 5 feet long and 10 pounds heavy. Speaking of the musket that I used while volunteering, the Charleville musket had metal furniture on it, which made it kind of a little bit heavier than, say, the British long land or short land. That's the Brown Bess for the rest of you folks who don't know what a British long land or short land musket is. Go ahead, look it up. That'd be another fun fact for you. But with the Charleville musket, you start off with a musket that's about 5 feet long, roughly, and then you add another 2.5 feet to it with the bayonet, and it's sticking way out there.
Yeah,
you've got quite a reach with that bayonet, and when you thrust it forward, all that weight going at once, plus your own weight.
Something we're going to be discussing a infamous battle in our second season. And I'm pretty sure they had to resort to bayonets. And, there was no way they could keep using the guns.
That's
and
right.
I think the bayonets...
Of course, you're referring to risking.
Risking, yeah. Because I once heard someone describe it was basically it got to the point where they were throwing rocks and, hand to hand, literally, like choking your opponent to death. I mean, it got pretty brutal.
Both sides ran out of cartridges and then it went hand to hand.
Yeah. So
and the battle went on for hours. So.
Just wait your whistle, but when we get to it, it's pretty horrific. But yeah, the bayonet probably really came into use during that.
Yeah.
Time. Okay. So his training, like I said, got passed out through all the colonial militias, and it really helped him unify
the regular colonial regiments.
Yeah, how they the discipline was handled out. Now you have got to remember at the time the British military had their own discipline and everything. And, a lot of our, George Washington he had been a British officer. A lot of people.
During French and Indian.
Yeah.
Or 7 Years' War.
7 Years' War, yeah. So a lot of people forget that there were people who were leading the colonists who did have the British training.
Right.
Based on your opinion, because I know you've read more into the military training in different Europeans, was the Prussian training far superior than the British training?
Well, the British and the Prussian training followed pretty closely parallel to each other. Both was pretty brutal in the way of discipline, and with equally or even punishments that even might result in death. You could easily wind up with 600 lashings for a transgression, which is basically a death sentence over a long period of time. And if you were chained out on the post, strapped to the waist and whipped, and you passed out after a number of lashes, then you were taken down, left to recover for a while. But then after you did, you were brought right back out of the post to have your sentence continued. And let's say you pass out at 20. Well, okay. Then after you recover from that, they stick you back out there, and they start at 20, and they go 21, 22, and then you pass out at maybe 55. You've got that's 545 lashings left in your sentence, and so people want to avoid that kind of thing. But then there were troops that would get kind of masochistic. The Rangers and the other volunteers who are very knowledgeable over at Fort Stamix would tell me that there were guys who would get into trouble just so they get whipped, or they didn't care if they transgressed and got whipped. They'd go ahead and transgress anyway. Like gambling with their buttons. That was one thing. You weren't supposed to do that.
Sounds silly, but yeah.
That sort of thing. So, there are discipline issues in both armies, and this is how they dealt with it. And, of course, the drill was very similar to it. But yeah, I'd have to say that the Prussian manner was probably more brutal in the way of discipline than the British one.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Spoiler alert, we win. Okay. So what do you...
Yeah.
Okay, so how does our Congress pay the man who really helped mold our military?
After the war, he was granted citizenship. And he spent most of his time in New York City. But then he split that between his time up in the Adirondacks, where he was awarded 16,000 acres.
Yes.
And given a pension of 2,600 colonial dollars. And he split that time between New York City and his estate in the in the hills north of the Mohawk River. And he had grand plans for this estate in upstate New York, and there were plans for a mansion with 34 rooms, a stable, a greenhouse, and beyond the mansion, he wanted to build a town, much like the towns in Europe. But his plans for a grand estate may have been based on Freemason symbols. If you look at the plans for it, you can see where the symbols had been designed into the layout. But none of these plans came to fruition.
And there's a lot of Freemasonry at that time. It's not a big conspiracy or anything. The Freemasons were basically the Elks Club, the Moose Club, the Rotary Club of the day. That's where all the influential men would go and meet.
Yeah, it was no big secret.
Yeah. People were looking into it being, there was this big conspiracy. No, there isn't. It was just of that time period. That was what a lot of men with status would do. So, yeah. In November of 1794, he died after what may have been a stroke. He wanted a simple burial in an unmarked grave, wrapped in his military cloak, buried under a certain hemlock tree.
Hemlock. Now, why is that significant? Hemlock.
I don't.
Tree.
I would take me a couple minutes to look it up.
Well, then that's okay. That's just a fun fact for our listeners to look up.
But yeah, he really, at the end of his life, didn't want to brag. And he was flash all his life, and then, none of the plans came to fruition up there, but I think he kind of enjoyed having the two-room cabinet up there. Remember we were, when we were up there visiting them one time, we were told about those surveyors that went up to Casterland.
Oh, that's right. The surveyors.
And they stayed with the Baron.
Right.
And this was a few years before he died. And they talked about how gracious a host he was and how he really enjoyed the simpleness of it. Again, the main reason why his plans didn't come to fruition up there was because he'd pay these people money, pay the locals money, say, I want this done, head off to New York City, and never follow up with him, and comes back and they've spent all this money and done nothing.
Yeah, they've blown it all down at the local.
Right. He may have been great for military discipline, but when it came to working with civilians, he really had no clue. But, he was still very respected up there and everything, and granted they took his money, but,
For 10 years after his burial, road crews were expanding a road. And this must mean that they were getting very close to the hemlock tree that he was buried next to. And they needed to take it down. And his unmarked grave was disturbed. He had to be reburied, of course. So this grave was marked. But when the centennial of the nation was coming into being now, it was decided to go against Barron's wishes and make him a huge monument. That's where he lays now, to this very day. And under the marble and stone in the sacred grove. His estate and his resting place may not have been what he wanted, ultimately. But the lack of any unworldly disturbances might be because the Stueben is happy with his resting place on his estate. And Stueben Memorial Historical Site is staffed by rangers from Fort Stanwix. Its address is 941 Star Hill Road, Remsen, Remsen, New York, 13438. But it's only open from the end of May to the beginning of September. And if you would like more information, contact Fort Stanwix National Monument in Rome, New York. Yeah, so it's a beautiful, beautiful site. I do recommend going up there. Hey, while you're up there, Potato Hill ain't that far away. So so while you're looking for that green Plymouth.
Yeah. But here's the thing. That entire
check out the obelisk.
That entire area is just so full of legends, and here's Stueben in the middle of it. And he's probably the quietest of all the legends up there. He doesn't haunt it, nothing. We just got this really nice estate. And really, to set the scene, you're driving up there, you're on these backcountry roads, and there's a sign, and you look up there, and it's just a two-room cabin. And it kind of blows your mind. They have this memorial, and it's just this two-room cabin. Well, the actual memorial is deep in the woods, and
it's an unlikely place for something like that.
Yeah, it is.
And didn't you say it was not part of the national parks, but it's a state?
It's a state park.
It's a state park,
but run by the rangers of Fort Stanwix. Yeah.
So there's an association.
Right. The interesting part is where the cabin is in the memorial is not where he actually wanted his house.
No.
When his land was divided up after his death and sold to other people, the family ended up with that parcel. Never gave up that parcel, even when they were asked nicely.
Yeah, they wanted to buy it from them. They were going to be given fair market value, but they refused to sell.
And if you get up there and you can find out where that is exactly, and drive by their house, you can see why the Baron wanted that particular parcel.
A lovely view.
Yeah, and I'm not saying the area they did put his cabin in, which it was part of his estate, doesn't have a lovely view, but this one was like 10 times better.
For sure, yeah.
The other part about this memorial is how the trees were planted, and that was on orders of the Baron. He wanted the trees to represent his soldiers. Yeah. So that probably goes back to the hemlock tree there, and you can see it when you're there. You see how they were planted, and it does look like a regiment. It's really
the hemlock tree request was pretty specific.
Yeah. I don't know why it was specifically a hemlock, but that is an interesting fact about how the trees are laid out up there.
Yeah, again, that would be an interesting thing for you listeners to go and find out.
And yes, remember he was being accused of having homosexual affairs. Yes, Stueben was homosexual. And I think for a while there he was kind of brushed over in our history books because of that.
I think they cared about it initially. Yeah. I mean, in the time where Stueben was living. Yeah. It really wasn't an issue until until he went back to Prussia. And I think there was some kind of kerfuffle going on there. That's another thing for you guys to look up.
The theory I always heard was he did ruffle feathers when he was in the Prussian
It didn't become
army.
An issue. His orientation didn't become an issue until somebody tried taking him down.
Exactly. Then it became a major issue.
Then they tried using that, as a political tool.
And that's why he went to France. And then pretty soon the French were like, dude, that kind of bothers us too. And really, Franklin didn't care. The Continental Congress didn't care. They were just looking at his skills and didn't care about all that. But it was kind of, I don't think it was brushed over. I think out of respect for him at the time, they said that he had adopted sons, and I'm using air quotes. Right. Adopted sons. That was kind of their code that these were his boyfriends. And he did leave part of the estate to one of them, if I remember right. I could be wrong. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But
I'm not even certain if that part of the estate is still in that family name or what is going on.
But it is, where he is resting, it's gorgeous. And just down the hill, there's a lot of hills there. I can't be. Well, just down one of the hills from there is Remsen. And very Welsh.
Yes, it was predominantly settled by Welsh.
Yeah, you come down and there's the Welsh flag and everything. If you look through the cemetery there, which we'll get around to talking about one of these days because there's a lot of stories of the cemetery. Extremely Welsh names. If you go deeper into it, they're very old. We have a Welsh town overlooked over by a Prussian baron.
Quite a mixture.
Yes, and it's neat. Yeah, it's kind of.
Shout out to the people in Remsen.
Yes.
Yakit da.
Can't even tell you did it right. So anyway, that was the visit to the Baron. Yeah, very, very interesting. He ended up in that part of New York, And yet he was given acreage in every state of the Union, the fledgling United States at that time. But because of his debt, he kept having to sell off
the
land.
I mean, he had 1,000.
Yeah, but he kept this one because he loved it the most. Yeah, he'd go down and party in New York and hang out and socialize in New York City, but where he wanted to be was up in up in those hills up there. Can't blame him. It's gorgeous.
Yeah, absolutely. It's on a hill that overlooks all the other hills, and which gives you a view off into the horizon. And it seems like it goes on forever. It's lovely stuff. And if you ever get up there during the fall season where the leaves are turning, it's just it's gorgeous. Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah, so it's definitely not a haunted grove, but I would say you feel his presence there. He's happy. Yeah, he's happy. He's contented.
If he's a ghost, he's pretty contented up there.
So that was Barron Von Stueben, and yes, I definitely recommend going and visiting the Baron.
Definitely, yes.
It's well worth it.
Thank you for listening to our Gaslit podcast.
And yes, thank you. And Honey thanks you too. If you've heard her purring, she's been on my lap for quite some time. All right, so have a good one.
Yes, bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening to Unearthly Upstate. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Patreon, and on our webpage. We are on iTunes, Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, Podbean, and Google Podcasts. Please like, share, and review, and if you really like us, tell your friends. Unearthly Upstate is an Animated Liar Media production. The show is produced by Matt and Mari Manette, with purring provided by Honey and Lloyd. Research and writing done by Mari Manette. Music is by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0 license. Unless stated otherwise in the episode, the places mentioned in the broadcast have not paid or contacted us for any type of promotion. And please check out our webpage for full credit and sources for the episodes.